Well, welcome back. I'm so pleased you've decided to continue joining us for this 6-week consideration of the basic claims of the Christian faith. And we've seen, haven't we, the last two sessions, that no one has ever seen God until, that is, Jesus Christ came into the world. Do you remember we saw chapter 1, verse 14 of John's account of the life of Jesus? The Word became flesh, who created everything, the one who was there from the beginning, the one who made us all, has stepped onto the stage of world history. We can see God. We can know God. Of course, anyone can make such a bold claim, but the question is the person really who they're saying they are? Well, today we're going to begin to see some evidence that will show us that Jesus, yes, he was a human like you and me. He had a fleshly body, and yet he was totally different. Well, before we dive into the session, why don't you press pause and discuss the following question. If somebody claimed to be God, what would they have to be able to do to convince you that they really were? What sign would be enough to persuade you? Let me read that verse again, John chapter 1 and verse 14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We've seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Well, who are the we? Who had seen the glory of God, the godness of God? John and his friends, the early followers, disciples of Jesus. Well, I wonder if you were able to read on from verse 19 to the end of the chapter. Well, if you did, you will have seen that Jesus met these individuals and their lives were turned around. He said, "Follow me," and they did. And they went to find their friends and said, "Come and see who we have discovered." It may well be that you found the second half of chapter 1 quite difficult to understand. And it is for those of us who don't have any background understanding of the Old Testament. You see, that's the point. When you see about Christ and the Lamb and the Messiah, it helps us see what John is saying at the beginning of his book. It's like the drums are rolling and he's saying, this is a big moment. Here is the one that the Jewish people had been waiting for, God's promised king. That's the big point. Jesus is the promised one. I wonder if you've ever read Harry Potter. I know many of us have enjoyed those books growing up. Well, I had the joy last summer of finishing book 7 with my children. What a great time we had over a number of years reading through one big story, but split up over 7 books. Well, just imagine that I began reading Harry Potter number 6, or even number 7. Would they enjoy it? Well, yes, they would. There's lots to enjoy. There's much that they could have understood. But of course, there would be much that they wouldn't appreciate if they hadn't read from the beginning. And friends, we must remember that when we come to John's account of the life of Jesus, this is a little bit like turning up in the Harry Potter story in book 6 or even book 7. So much has gone on before. If you've done the Foundations course, you will have heard me saying that the Bible is 66 books written by more than 40 authors, and yet actually it's one book with one story. You can sum up the Bible with just 4 words: blessing, curse, promise, Christ. Well, in the Foundations course, we looked at those first 3 words. We saw that the Old Testament, it begins with blessing. And then quite quickly, we see the curse that God places the world under, death and judgment. And yet God promises right from the beginning, and we see this promise come again and again, that one day he will restore his creation under his rule, that once again God's people could enjoy the blessing of relationship with him. And it all hinges on this promise. And as you read through the Old Testament, we see that central to this promise, central to bringing it about, is God raising up a king who will defeat evil once and for all. And the Jewish people, the Hebrews, were waiting for this promised Messiah or Christ. Christ is not a surname, it's a title. Jesus the Christ, the promised anointed king. Well, the claim in John's Gospel is that Jesus is the promised king. Do you remember the purpose statement that we have looked at the last couple of weeks? Comes right at the end of John's account, telling us why he's written. And he wants us to have life. How are we going to have life? Well, by believing Jesus is the Christ. Well, now at last we're going to see one of the signs that John has included to persuade us of the fact that Jesus really is the Christ. Let's have a look together. If you read chapter 2, verses 1 to 11, and then discuss for 10 minutes or so, and then come back, and I will try and sum up what I hope you've seen together. The Word became flesh. We've seen his glory. Well, let me read verse 11, the end of the passage that I hope you've just had a look at together. This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Friends, this is not fiction like Harry Potter. This actually happened. John is writing an eyewitness account of the events that took place. This happened in Galilee, in Palestine. These are eyewitness details, things that he records to persuade us of who Jesus is. And what we've seen is amazing. I hope you would agree. We all love a good wedding, I'm sure. Friends, weddings in those days were very different to the affairs that we have today of perhaps a few hours, a good party. No, these happen over several days. I imagine it could well have been true in your home country as well. Maybe it still happens in certain places. Over many days, great celebrations, a great chance to honor guests, a great chance to celebrate. Well, this wedding would have been no exception. And who knows how many days had already gone. But then this terrible thing happens. At least terrible for the host of the wedding. How embarrassing. They ran out of wine. What does that say to the guests? We haven't prepared enough for you. You're not that important. What a loss of face. What shame. And yet Mary senses that Jesus, her son, will be able to do something about this. And Jesus does the most incredible thing, doesn't he? He turns water into wine. Not just some wine, but hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bottles worth of wine. Not just the amount of wine, but the quality of the wine. Did you notice that? Why on earth did you bring out the best wine last? Now, I hope you're thinking, this is extraordinary. You can't just produce wine out of nothing. Wine takes days, months, years to ferment and become a quality wine. Surely, Christian friend, you're not expecting me to believe this. This is simply unscientific. Friends, I realize the temptation is to think that the original readers were uneducated and that, of course, they didn't understand science like we do in the 21st century. But friends, the point is, this is a miracle. That's why it's exceptional. This is a sign that shows us Jesus is not like you and me. This is not scientifically impossible. It is scientifically exceptional. Do you get the difference? Friends, it would be unscientific to say this is impossible, but it's scientifically exceptional. The existence of laws in nature that make us think, how can this be? That is evidence that there is a creator who has put order into our world. But of course, if Jesus is the Word, the one who made this world, come into our world, then surely he's more than able to interrupt those laws of nature. Actually, for me, the absence of miracles would be a problem in persuading me that Jesus really is who he says he is. you remember how John began this account? Jesus is the Word, the source of all life, the one who created everything. And so here we see him being able to create something out of nothing. It would be a bit odd if Jesus couldn't do these kind of things, if he claimed to be the Word. And as you read on, you'll discover in John that on several more occasions, he does things that only the creator of the universe could possibly do. Actually, this is far more than just a sign showing us that Jesus is God. Now, this is something much bigger. This is showing us that Jesus, God's Son, has come to bring in a new creation. Think back to the Harry Potter stories. When you get to book 6 or 7, there are times when things are mentioned that remind us of things that were said before, and now they begin to make more sense as things unfold, as perhaps prophecies are fulfilled. Similarly, in John's Gospel, we see lots of ideas from the Old Testament are made sense of when we get to John's account. So even from the very beginning, do you remember we saw the Word has become flesh? Literally, in the original language, the Word has tabernacled himself, tented. So in the Old Testament, God dwelt with his people in a tent. And Jesus here is tenting himself into the world. Well, here, similarly, in the wedding at Cana, it just looks like a wedding, doesn't it? But no, there are Old Testament ideas, wine and the bridegroom. And just for a moment, let's listen to some passages from the Old Testament that the original reader ought to have been familiar with. Firstly, wine. Isaiah 25. Isaiah the prophet giving hope to God's people that yes, now life might be very difficult, but one day what? Well, let me read. Isaiah 25 verse 6. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine, well refined. And he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth. This picture of a future day when there'll be feasting and celebration, and at last God's people will be in a new creation. There'll be no more tears. There'll be celebration. There'll be wine. Did you notice that? Well-aged wine, wine of the most wonderful quality. And best of all, there'll be no more death. And you may think, well, isn't it a bit far-fetched to connect the wine in this wedding at Cana with the wine of Isaiah 25? And yet, as we read on, when we get to the end of this section in John, we have this wonderful second sign of death being swallowed up. Yes, Isaiah and his prophecy is all over John's account. Well, let me continue in Isaiah, and this time we're going to see this concept of the bridegroom, which comes up again and again in the Old Testament scriptures. Isaiah 62 and verse 5. For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your sons marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. You see, God describes himself as the bridegroom to Israel, to his people. They are to be in a marriage covenant relationship. And so do you see what we're seeing at the very outset of John's gospel? That Jesus is the bridegroom. He takes on the role that the bridegroom should have done. The bridegroom had failed in his job of providing enough wine for the guests, and yet Jesus steps up and he acts in the role of the bridegroom. Now, again, you may think that seems a bit far-fetched, but read on and we see in chapter 3, again, Jesus is referred to as the bridegroom. Chapter 4, Jesus acts as the husband in a conversation with a woman. Jesus, the promised bridegroom. Indeed, back in chapter 54 of Isaiah, he says, your maker is your husband. keep reading in John, and we'll see that this is exactly what Jesus comes to do, to deal with the problem of death, to offer resurrection life, life in a new world, a new creation. Will there be no more tears? A world where there is relationship with the bridegroom, with God himself. I wonder how that makes you feel. We're going to pause for a few moments before I then come back to make some concluding comments. Well, I wonder what you discussed at the beginning of the session. Do you remember the scenario? If someone claimed to be God, what would they have to do to persuade you that they really were? Let me read verse 11 one more time. This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory. Read on in John and we'll see he does some more amazing signs, things that only God could do. Signposts that point us to the reality of who Jesus is and why he came. I don't know about you, but sometimes I meet people who are a bit surprised at John's decision to include this as the first of the signs, because he did lots of things, signs that he could have included that he didn't, but he's chosen to include this particular one at this particular point in his account. Why is that? Friends, this is not some sort of party trick. Well done, Jesus. He can turn water into wine. No, this is something much bigger, as we've seen in this session. That Jesus, John is claiming, is the promised king, the one who's come to bring in a new creation, a world where there's no more death, a world of feasting with God himself in intimate marriage relationship with God's as the bridegroom. So for the original readers familiar with the Old Testament, this should not have been a surprise. But there are at least two surprises that I think it is worth us mentioning in the text, at least surprises to us in the 21st century. They're both in verse 4. Let me read. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Two surprises. First one, Jesus' relationship with his mother. Have you already talked about that with your friend? It seems surprising, doesn't it? Why is Jesus so abrupt with her? Read on in John, and I can reassure you that Jesus is very good at modeling to us what it is to honor his parents. I don't think John is trying to tell us here that Jesus was rude. Amazing, you get to the end of John's gospel, Jesus at his moment of greatest need, dying. And rather than caring about himself, he's asking friends to look after his mother. Second surprise is what Jesus says about the hour. My hour has not yet come. What's he talking about? What is this hour? We'll read on in John and we discover what he's talking about. It is the hour of his death. Jesus says, don't bother me now. This is not my moment. This is not the time. And yet he still goes ahead and provides wine. He does help out. Why does he do that? I think what he's doing here is he's showing us in advance what the hour will achieve. This hour that he's come for will lead to a new creation. He's saying, I will show you now something of the blessing of what I'm bringing in when that hour comes. So there you have it. God's promised king sent to bring in a perfect new creation. I hope that's helped in beginning to see something of the significance of who Jesus is and why he came. But I imagine you've got all manner of questions. And now's going to be a good chance to keep asking your friends. But some of the questions, let me say, will be answered in the next session. So, for example, great, Jesus bringing in a new world, but who's going to be in that new world? Who's going to be qualified to be a part of this perfect new creation? Come back for the next session, and that's what we're going to think about. The disciples believed. What does that mean? What does it mean to believe? When is this going to happen? Again, keep coming back for more, and we will see it. John is going to engage with those exact questions as we read on. Please read on. Why not read on the second half of chapter 2, and we will start in the next session at the end of chapter 2. Have a great rest of your week and look forward to seeing you next time.